The wind swept low over the desert that evening, curling dust around the hooves of a restless horse. The horizon burned orange, and the air smelled of dry sage and old battles. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, a hawk circled in slow silence, waiting for movement below. The Apache sat still against the dying sun, his dark eyes steady, his expression carved from stone. They said he was a man who feared nothing, who lived by his own law and bowed to no one. Yet for all his strength and wild pride, he carried a burden that none could see. Women admired him, envied him, even feared him, but not one had ever touched his heart, nor softened the iron that seemed to live inside his soul. He was known across the plains as the man of impossible pride. In every settlement from Santa Fe to the edges of the San Pedro Valley, stories traveled about him. Some said he had the body of a warrior and the temper of a storm. Others claimed that the spirits had cursed him, making him a man too proud to love, too fierce to be tamed. The elders called him a symbol of the old ways, but the younger men whispered that something in him was broken. He rode alone, hunted alone, and trusted no one except the land beneath him and the sky above. Years of war had left, deep scars on the desert and deeper ones on his spirit. He had seen his people betrayed, his home taken, his traditions mocked by settlers who did not understand the value of silence, the meaning of strength, or the depth of old honor. He had fought them, driven them back, watched them return again and again. And though he lived with the pride of a man who refused defeat, a quiet hollowness grew within him. His masculinity was his armor, yet it kept him distant from everything that might have saved him in the nearby town. Talk of him was both fearful and fascinated. The saloon keeper would lean over the bar and tell travelers how the Apache once rode straight through a cavalry patrol with no weapon but a single knife. The blacksmith swore he saw him take down a bear with his bare hands. The women, sitting in their porches at dusk, would whisper about his eyes, sharp and unreadable. They said he looked at a woman as though he could see right through her soul, but never once had anyone seen him truly smile. To most, it was an untouchable legend, a man made of myth and dust. But legends have cracks too, and behind his silence was a story no one dared to ask. He lived in the borderlands, far from the reach of soldiers and settlers, where the land itself decided who belonged. His camp was built near a dried-up riverbed, where a single mesquite tree still grew against the odds. Each morning he would rise before dawn, tend his horse, and sit facing east, waiting for the first light to break the darkness. It was his way of remembering those who had been lost, of proving to himself that he was still alive one evening. When the air turned cool and the sound of crickets filled the emptiness, something unusual stirred the horizon. He saw smoke, thin and distant, curling up from the west. It wasn't from a fire, he recognized. The settlers rarely came that far, and the cavalry had not ridden through in weeks. He watched for a while, his instincts tightening like a drawn bow. Something was coming, something that would disturb the stillness he had built around himself. By the time the stars rose, he could hear faint sounds, a wagon wheel creaking, the low whimper of a horse, the faint echo of struggle. He followed the noise, his steps silent and measured. In the shadow of a narrow ravine, he found a broken wagon. The horses were gone, the supplies scattered, and beside it, a small figure lay unmoving. He knelt beside her carefully. She was young, no more than 18, her dress torn from the rough desert wind. Her hands were scraped, her face pale under the moonlight. But even in that state there was something about her, something pure and still. Like water untouched by the world, she was alive, barely. He carried her back to his camp, wrapped her in a blanket, and watched over her through the night. She stirred once, murmuring words he didn't understand, her voice soft but steady. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him without fear. He didn't know what had brought her there, but something in him refused to walk away. Maybe it was the way she seemed lost yet unafraid, or maybe it was because, for the first time, he saw something stronger than his own silence. When morning came, she opened her eyes. They were clear, a pale blue that reminded him of the mountain sky after rain. She looked at him not with fear or suspicion, but with a strange, calm curiosity. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the rhythm of another world, the sound of towns, church bells, and soft learning. She told him her wagon had been attacked, her family scattered, maybe gone. She had been running, trying to find water, when everything went dark. He said little, only nodded, tending the fire while she rested. She watched him move, the way his muscles shifted beneath his skin, the quiet precision of every gesture. He carried himself like a man who knew both life and death too well. She felt an odd safety in his silence, though she could sense the wall he kept around himself. There was power in him, yes, but also a loneliness so deep it almost frightened her. As the days passed, she began to heal. He began to speak, not much, but enough. He told her of the land, of the seasons, of how to read the wind and listen to the earth. She listened, learning quickly, feeling a strange pull toward the life he lived. The desert no longer seemed empty. It felt alive, breathing beneath their feet. Yet she could see that he carried something heavy, something that made him look away when she met his eyes. In the stillness of one evening, as the fire burned low, she asked him why he lived alone. He didn't answer at first. Then, after a long pause, he said quietly that men like him were not meant for gentleness. That his strength was not a gift but a curse. She wanted to argue, to tell him that strength could protect as much as it could destroy. But she could see that his wounds ran deeper than words could reach. He rose and walked to the edge of the camp, staring out into the dark. The wind carried the faint scent of rain, rare in that season. He turned to her, his face shadowed, his voice low. "The desert takes what it wants," he said. "It doesn't ask. It doesn't give back." She understood that he wasn't speaking of the land anymore. He was speaking of his past, of love lost, of something that had hardened him long ago. That night, neither of them slept much. The storm came just before dawn, rolling over the cliffs with thunder that shook the ground. The girl huddled near the fire, and the Apache stood outside, letting the rain soak through his hair, his skin, his silence. It was the first rain he had felt in months, and it felt almost like forgiveness. When the storm finally broke and the sky began to clear, the air was filled with the scent of wet earth and renewal. But as the light returned, he noticed something else: tracks in the mud, fresh and deep. Riders had passed nearby, heading straight toward the canyon. He knew what that meant. Whoever had attacked her wagon wasn't far behind. His calm eyes hardened again, and the peace that had begun to grow between them trembled on the edge of danger. He turned back to her, and she saw, for the first time, not just a man of strength, but a man preparing to protect something more than himself. And as the wind shifted once more, carrying the sound of hooves in the distance, he realized that for the first time in his life, his strength might mean something more than survival. It might mean love, and it might mean loss. The desert waited, silent and watchful, as the storm inside him began to rise again. The air after the storm carried a strange stillness, the kind that comes when the earth holds its breath, waiting to see what will happen next. The Apache stood near the edge of his camp, scanning the horizon, every sense alert. The girl watched him quietly, her hands folded in her lap. The tracks he'd found still marked the ground outside, deep, sharp impressions that told him more than words could. These were not travelers or passing soldiers. They were men hunting something, or someone. And by the look of them, they had no plans to stop until they found what they wanted. He didn't tell her everything, only that riders were close. She could see the concern in his eyes, even though he spoke with calm certainty. The way he moved reminded her of the hawk that circled above the cliffs, focused, patient, always ready to strike if needed. The morning sun began to rise, painting the land in pale gold, but there was no peace in that light. Somewhere beyond the ridges, danger waited. While he prepared his horse, she gathered what little food remained from his supplies. She was careful not to get in his way, yet part of her wanted to understand him more. In the days since he had found her, she had learned that he lived by quiet order. Everything had a reason, a rhythm. The bow and arrows laid in perfect balance beside the fire. The horse brushed and fed before dawn. The weapons cleaned and checked, even when no threat seemed near. He lived as though the world could turn against him at any moment. Maybe for him it always had. When he finally spoke again, his voice was steady. "We leave soon," he said. They will come through the canyon by midday. She hesitated, unsure where he planned to go. Will they find us? She asked softly. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable. They will, if we stay. They rode through the morning, the desert stretching endless around them. The ground was damp from the rain, and the scent of wet soil mixed with the sweetness of sagebrush. For hours, neither of them spoke. She watched the way he read the land, how his gaze followed the sky, how he seemed to know when the ground beneath the horse's hooves changed from soft clay to hidden stone. He had been part of this land for so long that he moved as if guided by something ancient, something beyond thought. By midday, they stopped at a ridge overlooking a valley. The view below was wide and open, dotted with mesquite trees and low shrubs. The girl dismounted and sat on a rock, her body aching from the ride. He stood beside her, scanning the horizon again. She followed his gaze, but saw nothing but the open plain. Still, his tension didn't ease. You can't see them, he said quietly, but they're close. The land speaks before the eyes see. She shivered a little at his words. The way he spoke carried a wisdom that came from somewhere deeper than education or books. She thought about her father, a trader who had believed the desert was a place of profit, not power. He had taught her to bargain, to trust the price of things. But sitting beside the Apache, she realized that out here, survival wasn't about gold or trade. It was about listening to wind, to silence, to instinct. As they rested, she asked him about his people. For the first time, his face softened. He told her of the old ways of the ceremonies and songs that had once echoed across the canyons. He spoke of the pride they carried, the balance they sought between earth and spirit. Then his voice grew heavier. Many forgot, he said. When the white soldiers came, they burned the land, took the horses, the food, the children. Some of us fought. Some of us were taken. The rest disappeared into the hills. His words were quiet, but the weight of them hung in the air. She listened, feeling the ache in his tone. He didn't speak with anger, but with something sadder, a deep weariness. The kind that comes when a man has fought for too long and seen too much loss. She wanted to say something, but she knew that words couldn't heal what had been broken. They stayed on that ridge until the light began to fade. When night came, the air turned colder. The Apache built a small fire, careful to keep it low. The flickering glow cast long shadows across his face. He sat in silence, sharpening his knife, while she watched the stars appear above. The desert sky looked endless, full of quiet beauty. She wondered what it must feel like to belong to it so completely, and yet feel so alone within it. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. Do you ever miss them? The ones you lost? He stopped sharpening and looked into the fire. Every day, he said simply. Then he glanced at her, his expression unreadable. But missing them doesn't bring them back. It only makes the nights longer. His honesty unsettled her. She wasn't used to such direct truth. In the world she came from, people hid their pain behind polite smiles and soft words. But he didn't hide anything. Everything about him was raw, real, and unfiltered. And maybe that was why she found herself drawn to him, because he carried his truth openly, even when it hurt. Later that night, when the fire burned low, they heard it again, the faint sound of hooves in the distance. He rose at once, every muscle alert. The girl's heart raced as she listened. The sound was growing closer, echoing through the canyon walls. He motioned for her to stay quiet, then moved toward the shadows, his bow ready. Minutes passed like hours. The night was still except for the beating of her heart. Then, from the darkness beyond the firelight, came a voice, rough, mocking. We know you're out there. The Apache froze, his eyes narrowing. He recognized that tone, that arrogance. He had heard it years before, in another fight that had cost him too much. The voice came again, closer now. You can't hide forever. The girl belongs to us. The words hit like a spark in the cold air. She looked at him, fear flashing in her eyes. He didn't look back at her, but his jaw tightened. There was something dangerous in his stillness, a fury buried deep beneath calm control. He didn't answer them, didn't move. The silence stretched until the only sound was the soft crackle of the fire. Then, as quickly as they had come, the voices faded back into the dark. Maybe they had retreated, or maybe they were circling, waiting for daylight. Either way, the message was clear. The past she had tried to escape was not done with her yet. When he returned to the fire, his expression was unreadable. She wanted to ask what would happen next, but something in his eyes stopped her. Instead, she simply said, "You're not afraid of them, are you?" He shook his head. "Fear is for those who have something left to lose." His words were quiet, but she could feel the pain behind them. They didn't sleep much that night. When dawn came, he packed their things again, his movements quick and deliberate. "We go north," he said. "There's a place near the cliff's old ground. They won't follow there." She didn't argue. Whatever trust had been building between them had grown into something wordless, something real. As they rode, the land began to change. The flat plains rose into rocky slopes, and the wind grew stronger. The air carried a faint scent of pine, a reminder that somewhere ahead, life still clung to the edges of the desert. She could feel exhaustion creeping into her body, but his steady presence kept her from faltering. He rode ahead, every motion purposeful, every glance scanning for signs of pursuit. By the time the sun set again, they had reached a narrow pass between two cliffs. He stopped there, dismounted, and studied the ground. "This was my father's place," he said softly. "Long ago." The girl looked around, taking in the rough beauty of the land. It felt sacred somehow, untouched by time. He led her to a small hollow where they could rest. As the firelight flickered against the rocks, she studied his face, the quiet strength in his eyes, the scars that told more stories than words ever could. She wondered if he knew how much he had already changed her, how much he had opened her eyes to a world beyond her own. The night grew colder, and the wind howled between the cliffs. Somewhere far below, a coyote cried out, its lonely call echoing across the valley. The girl shivered and pulled the blanket tighter around her. The Apache watched the fire, lost in thought. The danger still lingered, closer than ever, but for now, there was a fragile calm between them. He knew it couldn't last. The men who hunted her were not the kind to give up, and somewhere deep inside, he felt the pull of something stronger than pride, a need to protect, not just out of duty, but out of something he couldn't yet name. As the flames flickered low, he looked toward the shadows of the canyon and felt the weight of what was coming. The desert was quiet again, but its silence no longer felt empty. It was waiting, watching, and both of them knew that the storm they had escaped was only the beginning. The next morning, it was pale and cold. The kind of morning where the air feels too still, as if the world itself is listening. The Apache was already awake, standing on a ledge above their small camp, watching the valley below. From where he stood, the land looked endless and harsh, a stretch of sand, stone, and secrets. The girl stirred near the fire, rubbing her hands together for warmth. She looked smaller than usual, wrapped in one of his blankets, her hair tangled from the wind. When she noticed him watching the horizon, she asked softly if the riders were still following. "They're close," he said. His tone was quiet, not out of fear, but from the kind of awareness born of long survival. "They'll try to come through the canyon by nightfall." She felt a tightening in her chest. Every time she began to feel safe, the memory of danger returned. He turned toward her, his expression calm. "You should rest. We'll move before sundown." But she couldn't rest. Every sound, the rustle of brush, the far-off cry of a bird, made her nerves jump. She watched him move around the camp, his motions precise and silent. There was something grounding about him, something steady, even in moments when everything else seemed uncertain. Yet she could sense the strain behind his calm. For all his quiet strength, there was a heaviness in his eyes, like he carried ghosts that never stopped whispering. By mid-afternoon, they started up a narrow path between the cliffs. The wind grew stronger, carrying bits of dust and dry leaves through the air. The girl followed close behind him, clutching the horse's reins. The higher they climbed, the quieter the world became. The canyon below seemed miles away now, swallowed in shadow. When they finally reached a plateau, he stopped and motioned for her to dismount. "We stay here for now," he said. "It's high ground. They won't find us easily." She nodded, grateful for a moment of stillness. The plateau opened to a wide view of the desert below. The land looked both beautiful and dangerous, like something alive and humid. As the day faded into dusk, the Apache built a small fire. The girl sat near it, staring into the flames. "Why do they want me?" she asked suddenly. "Those men who attacked us? Why would they follow me all this way?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes it isn't about you," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's about what others think you carry." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small pouch she hadn't noticed before. He opened it and poured a handful of small stones into his palm. They shimmered faintly in the firelight, rough, uncut, but strikingly blue. "Turquoise," he said. "Sacred to my people. The stone of protection." She blinked in surprise. "You think they want those?" He shook his head slowly. "No, these are nothing to them. But there are men who believe that the desert still hides more. Mines, relics, things worth killing for." His voice dropped lower. "Your wagon may have been carrying something they thought was theirs." Her breath caught. "But we didn't have anything. My father was just trading supplies." "Maybe he didn't tell you everything," he said. "Maybe someone else did." The fire cracked, sending a burst of sparks into the night. She stared at the glowing stones in his hand. They reminded her of her father's stories, of how he used to speak of lost mines and treasure buried in the desert. He always said there was truth hidden beneath the old legends. For the first time, she wondered if his curiosity had cost them everything. The Apache closed his hand around the stones and put them away. "People chase ghosts," he said, "and they don't stop until they have something to hold." The night deepened, and the stars came out one by one. The girl felt sleep tugging at her eyes, but unease kept her awake. The desert seemed alive around them, the shifting wind, the faint echo of distant hooves. She turned toward him, but he was gone from the fire. Panic rushed through her until she saw him standing a few yards away. Bow drawn, eyes fixed on the dark below. He didn't move for a long time. Then he lowered the bow and came back. "They're closer than I thought," he said. "2 riders. Maybe 3. Her pulse quickened. "What do we do?" He glanced toward the horses. "We wait until they show themselves. If we run now, we'll only lead them to open ground." The fire burned low, and the night stretched on. Every minute felt heavier than the last. Then, from the edge of the plateau, came a faint glimmer, a flicker of light, like a torch moving through the canyon. The Apache's muscles tensed. He watched until the light disappeared, swallowed by darkness again. "They're tracking by the stars," he said quietly. "They know the old trails." She looked at him, confused. "Then how do we stay ahead?" He met her gaze. "We stop trying to run. We make them come to us." His plan was dangerous, but she trusted him. He had the kind of certainty that made even fear feel manageable. As the hours passed, he began to move around the camp, placing stones, checking his arrows, and setting traps made from twisted branches and loose rope. She watched him work, fascinated by the precision of every movement. He didn't waste a single motion. When dawn finally broke, the light revealed a land washed clean by cold air. The girl stepped to the edge of the plateau and looked down. There, far below, she could see faint movement, dark shapes crossing the plain. The riders were coming. She turned toward him, her voice trembling. "There are more than 2, he joined her, his face unreadable. 5, he said after a moment. "Maybe 6, but only 3 will come up this way. The rest will circle." She swallowed hard. "And if they find the trail, then we fight." His voice was calm, but his eyes held something fierce, something old. They spent the day preparing. He gave her a knife, showed her how to use it if she needed to. "You strike fast," he said. "You don't wait." She didn't like the feel of the weapon in her hand, but she nodded. The tension in the air grew thicker as the sun dipped lower, by the time night came again. The first of the riders appeared at the edge of the canyon. They didn't move fast, only steady, confident. The Apache crouched behind a rock, bow in hand, watching their every move. The girl stayed back, hidden in the shadows, her heart pounding. She could see their torches now, 3 of them, moving like fireflies through the dark. The first rider reached the foot of the trail leading up to the plateau. The Apache waited, silent as stone. When the second rider followed, he moved, releasing a single arrow. The sound was sharp and clean. The torch dropped, and a cry echoed through the night. Chaos followed. The other 2 shouted, guns flashing. The girl flinched at the sound. The Apache fired again, then ducked behind the rocks as bullets tore through the air. The horses below panicked, rearing against the gunfire. Then everything went quiet again, except for the wind. The girl held her breath, afraid to move. The Apache stayed crouched, his eyes searching the darkness. One of the riders was still alive. She could hear him moving, dragging himself toward cover. Minutes passed before the sound faded. When the Apache finally turned back toward her, his face was grim. "They'll come again," he said, "and next time, they'll bring more." The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "We can't fight them all," he nodded slowly. "No, but we can make them think we can." He began packing their things again, quick and silent. "There's an old mission north of here," he said. "Abandoned long ago. We'll go there. It's safe for a while." As they rode into the dark, the girl glanced back toward the canyon. The torches had disappeared, but the fear hadn't. She felt it pressing on her chest. Following them like a shadow, they traveled through the night, stopping only when the first light touched the hills. The mission appeared ahead, its walls crumbling but still standing against time. The Apache dismounted and looked around carefully. "This place has history," he said. "It was built before the war. Many died here." The girl followed him inside. The air was cool and still, thick with dust and memory. Faded crosses hung on the walls, and old carvings covered the stone. She felt uneasy, as though the place was watching them. As he set up camp, she wandered through the ruined halls. In one corner, she found a rusted chest, half buried in sand. She called him over, and together they pried it open. Inside were old papers, torn and faded, along with a small metal emblem. The Apache held it up to the light. It was shaped like a sun, with strange markings etched around the edge. He frowned. "This symbol," he said slowly, "it belongs to the old miners, the ones who searched for silver near the sacred caves." Her heart quickened. "You think this is what they're after?" "Maybe," he said. "But if it is, then this place is not as forgotten as it seems." Before she could respond, a sound echoed from outside, faint, deliberate footsteps. The Apache's eyes met hers, and in that instant both knew the chase wasn't over. The danger had only followed them deeper into the desert's heart. The footsteps outside the old mission grew heavier, each one echoing against the crumbling stone walls. The Apache motioned for the girl to stay silent, his body tense, bow already drawn. The sound moved closer, deliberate, as if whoever was out there knew they weren't alone. The faint flicker of torchlight appeared through the cracks in the doorway, sliding across the dusty floor. The girl's breath hitched, but she didn't make a sound. The Apache moved toward the entrance. Slow and steady, his knife glinting faintly in the moonlight. When the door creaked open, a gust of wind blew through the mission, scattering dust into the air. A man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, his hat shadowing his face. His coat was torn, and his boots coated in sand. He wasn't one of the riders they'd seen before. His stance was more cautious, almost weary. The Apache didn't lower his weapon, but he didn't strike either. The man raised a hand. "I mean no harm," he said quietly. "I've been following those men too. They're not who they say they are." The girl exchanged a quick look with the Apache. The stranger's voice carried a tone of truth, but there was something guarded in his eyes. He stepped farther into the light, revealing a weathered face, lined from years under the sun. "They're treasure hunters," he continued. "Been chasing stories about lost silver mines for years. I worked with them once, before I knew what kind of devils they were." The Apache studied him closely. "Why follow them now?" The man hesitated. "Because they're looking for something they shouldn't find." His gaze shifted toward the emblem lying on the table. "That symbol there, it's part of a map. Leads to the old mines under this desert. They think it's silver, but it's older than that. They'll kill anyone who gets in their way." The girl stepped forward. Then why warn us? Because, the man said slowly, they'll be here before sunrise. And when they come, they won't care who's innocent. The Apache didn't reply. His eyes stayed fixed on the stranger, measuring every word. The girl could see the conflict in his face. Part of him wanted to believe, but another part refused to trust anyone new. Too many betrayals had already carved their marks on him. Finally, he spoke. "You can stay till dawn," he said. "After that, you go your way." The man nodded. "Fair enough." He dropped his gear near the wall and sat down. The air between them stayed heavy, filled with the kind of silence that holds more questions than answers. Outside, the wind howled against the broken roof. The girl sat near the fire, her thoughts restless. She looked at the emblem again, tracing the rough edges with her fingers. The markings didn't look like anything she'd ever seen before. Circles, lines, symbols that seemed to shimmer when the firelight touched them. "Do you think it's real?" she asked softly. "The mine?" The Apache's gaze lingered on the flames. "There are things buried in this land that were never meant to be found," he said. "People dig for riches and find curses instead." The stranger let out a bitter laugh. "He's right about that. Men lose their minds chasing what they can't understand. I watched them burn half a camp just to find a handful of metal that crumbled in their hands." The girl looked from one man to the other. "Then why do they still chase it?" "Because greed doesn't die easy," the stranger replied. The night stretched long and uneasy. Every now and then, the Apache would stand and move through the shadows, listening. His instincts were sharper than any map or weapon. The girl tried to sleep, but dreams wouldn't come. The sound of the wind mixed with her memories, the fire, the screams, the way her father's hand had slipped from hers when the attack began. She didn't know if he was still alive, or if he had fallen among the flames. When dawn's first light touched the broken walls, the Apache was already outside, scanning the horizon. The air was dry again, the storm long gone, leaving only dust and silence. The stranger joined him, squinting into the distance. "They'll come from the south," he said. "That's where the canyon opens." The Apache nodded. "Then we close it before they reach the pass." The girl followed them out, shielding her eyes from the light. The valley below shimmered faintly, heat already rising from the sand. It was too quiet. No wind, no birds, only the weight of waiting. They moved fast, gathering what supplies they could. The Apache showed her where to hide if things went wrong, an old storeroom beneath the mission floor, half buried in rock. "You stay here if I tell you," he said. "No matter what happens." She wanted to protest, but something in his tone stopped her. By mid-morning, the first sign appeared, a thin line of dust on the horizon, moving fast. The stranger cursed under his breath. They brought more this time. "Looks like a dozen." The Apache's jaw tightened. "Then we make them think there's more of us too." They began setting traps through the ruins rocks. Balance to fall, paths covered with loose gravel to muffle sound. The Apache worked with quiet focus, every motion sure. The stranger kept glancing toward the open valley, his nerves showing through his rough exterior. When the riders finally appeared, they came in a tight formation, horses kicking up sand. Their leader, a tall man in a dark coat, rode ahead. His face was hidden behind a scarf, but his voice carried across the open ground. "You can't hide forever," he called out. "Give us the girl, and we'll let you walk away." The girl's heart raced. She looked at the Apache, but he didn't move. He just watched, his eyes cold as stone. The leader laughed. "You're wasting your time, warrior. You can't fight us all." The Apache's reply was quiet, but it carried. "I don't need to fight all of you. Only the ones foolish enough to take another step." The next second, the first trap went off a rock slide, tumbling from the cliff above, scattering the riders. Shouts filled the air. The Apache loosed an arrow, then another, each one finding its mark. The stranger fired from the window of the mission, smoke curling from his rifle. Chaos broke loose. Horses screamed, men shouted orders. The girl crouched inside, clutching the knife he had given her. The air was thick with dust and gunfire. She could barely see through the narrow slit of the wall, but she could hear everything: the pounding hooves, the sharp whistle of arrows. the echo of bullets against stone. Then she heard a different sound, sharp cry, close. She turned and saw the stranger fall back from the window, clutching his shoulder. Blood darkened his sleeve. The Apache pulled him away from the line of fire, eyes scanning for another shot. "They're splitting up," the stranger gasped. 3 of them, coming from the back. The Apache grabbed his bow and ran toward the rear entrance. The girl followed before he could stop her. The back of the mission opened into a narrow passage filled with debris. Shadows moved among the rocks. She saw the flicker of metal, a gun barrel catching the light. The Apache moved fast, silent as wind. He dropped one of the attackers with a swift strike, then turned, catching another by surprise. The third fired, the shot echoing through the ruins. The girl screamed as the Apache stumbled, dropping to one knee. The man raised his gun again, but she didn't think. She lunged forward, swinging the knife the way he had shown her. The blade cut across the attacker's arm, and he fell back with a curse. The Apache recovered just in time, finishing the fight with brutal precision. When it was over, the girl stood trembling, the knife still in her hand. The Apache looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You did what you had to," he said quietly. They didn't have time to rest. More riders were coming. The stranger staggered toward them, pale but still standing. "They've got dynamite," he said hoarsely. "They'll blow the walls if they can't get in." The Apache's face hardened. "Then we end it before they do." He turned to the girl. "Get to the storeroom. Stay there until I call." She didn't want to leave, but she knew arguing would only waste time. She backed toward the entrance, watching as he stepped out into the open. The sunlight hit him full on, outlining his figure against the desert. He looked like something born from the land itself, Ilding, fierce and ready for whatever came. From her hiding place, she could hear the final standoff unfolding outside. The leader's voice rose again, angry now. "You can't win this." The Apache's reply was low, but clear. "Maybe not, but neither will you." Then came the roar of gunfire, the crack of rifles, and the thunder of hooves. Dust filled the air, thick as smoke. The ground shook as one of the walls gave way. She could see flashes of light through the cracks, gunfire, sparks, movement. Every heartbeat felt like an eternity. The stranger fired from the side window, covering the Apache as he moved through the open ground. The girl could hear the sound of shouting, closer and closer. The fight was reaching its breaking point. She clutched the knife tighter, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. And then, above the chaos, came a single deafening explosion. The world seemed to tilt, the sound echoing through the canyon like thunder. The girl was thrown to the ground, the air knocked from her chest. Dust poured into the storeroom as stones fell from the ceiling. When the noise finally faded, all she could hear was her own breathing and the faint crackle of fire somewhere above. She pushed herself up, coughing, calling out his name. There was no answer. Only silence. The mission walls still stood, but the world around them had changed. The air smelled of smoke and iron. Somewhere beyond the haze, the desert was waking again. And as she took a trembling step toward the shattered doorway, she knew the moment of truth was coming, the one that would decide not just their fate, but what kind of world they would have left when the dust finally settled. The air was thick with smoke and silence when the girl finally stepped out of the storeroom. The world outside the mission looked broken and strange, covered in dust and fragments of stone. The explosion had torn through one of the walls, leaving the morning sun bleeding across the wreckage. Her ears still rang from the blast, but all she could think about was finding him. She stumbled across the uneven ground, calling out his name, her voice hoarse from the dust. At first there was no answer. Then she saw movement near the fallen archway. The Apache was lying half buried under debris, his face pale, but his chest rising faintly. She rushed to him, pushing the heavy stones away with trembling hands. He groaned softly as she helped him sit up, blood streaking the side of his arm, but his eyes still sharp. Relief washed through her so strong that she could hardly breathe. The stranger lay a few yards away, injured but alive. His shoulder was bandaged with a strip of torn fabric, and he gave her a weak smile when she reached him. "Guess we made it," he said in a rough whisper. She nodded. Though her eyes filled with tears as she looked at what was left of the mission, the riders were gone. The blast had scared off the survivors, their horses scattering across the desert. The leader's body lay near the outer wall, the map clutched tightly in his burned hand. The treasure he had chased had cost him everything, and in the end, there was nothing left but dust. The Apache stood slowly, leaning against the wall for balance. "It's finished," he said quietly. His gaze moved over the open land, toward the horizon where the heat shimmered in waves. "This place has taken enough from the living." They stayed there for a long while, letting the silence settle again. The desert, once filled with the noise of battle, had returned to its quiet rhythm, the whisper of wind over sand, the soft cry of a hawk circling above. The girl looked at the emblem still lying near the ashes of the fire. It was cracked now, half buried in dirt, but its strange markings still glowed faintly in the sunlight. "What do we do with it?" she asked. The Apache looked at it for a long moment. "We give it back to the earth," he said. "That's where it belongs." He picked it up and carried it to a spot beyond the ruins, where the ground was soft and dry. Together they dug a small hole and buried it beneath a cluster of desert stones. The girl placed her hand on the earth, whispering a quiet prayer, not for treasure, but for peace. When they stood again, the land around them seemed calmer, as if something old and restless had finally been laid to rest. Over the next few days, they tended to their wounds and rebuilt a small shelter among the remaining walls. The stranger grew stronger each day, though his arm never fully stopped trembling when he tried to lift his rifle. He spent hours staring out at the open desert, his eyes filled with the weight of everything he'd seen. One night, as the stars stretched wide across the sky, he spoke softly. "I spent half my life chasing what wasn't mine," he said. "All for silver and stories that turned to dust. Maybe this land was trying to teach me something all along." The girl nodded. "It taught all of us," she said. "Some lessons just take longer to hear." The Apache sat nearby, quiet but listening. His expression softened in the firelight. "This desert doesn't forgive easily," he said, "but it remembers those who try to understand it." They stayed there for another week, long enough for their strength to return and for the sand to begin to cover the scars left by the fight. The stranger decided to leave first. He packed lightly, taking only his canteen and a small piece of cloth he had found among the ruins. Before he left, he turned to them and said, "If I ever reach the border, I'll tell people this place should stay empty. Let it rest." The Apache nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. The girl watched the man disappear into the horizon until he became just another shape swallowed by the desert heat. When the time came for her and the Apache to move on, dawn painted the sky in soft colors of red and gold. They stood side by side, looking out at the endless stretch of sand ahead. She didn't know where they would go next, but she no longer felt afraid. The fear that had once followed her like a shadow had changed into something else, a quiet strength, shaped by loss, but steady and real. Before they left, she walked back into the mission one last time. The broken walls stood silent, their outlines glowing faintly in the morning light. In the corner, she found the old cross that had survived the blast. She brushed off the dust and placed it upright again, her fingers lingering on the worn wood. "For everyone who never made it out," she whispered. When she turned back, the Apache was waiting. They started walking north, their footprints fading behind them as the wind began to rise. As they traveled, the land slowly began to change. The harsh dunes gave way to softer plains, dotted with dry grass and scattered shrubs. They passed the remains of old trails, places where others had once walked and left their stories behind. The girl asked him once what he would do when they reached the next settlement. "I don't know," he said simply. "Maybe build something new. Maybe just keep walking until the land feels quiet again." She smiled faintly. Maybe that's enough. The journey was hard, but there was peace in the rhythm of it. Each day brought a little more distance from the ruins and a little more light back into their faces. At night, they shared stories not of treasure or war, but of small things. Rivers that still flowed in the north, mountains that held snow even in summer, and the sound of rain when it finally came. One evening, When the horizon glowed with the colors of dusk, the Apache paused and looked out toward the west. "Your people might still be out there," he said. "Maybe they found another camp." Her chest tightened at the thought. She had dreamed of finding her father again, of hearing his voice call her name. The hope had never left her, even through the fire and the fear. "If he's alive," she said, "he'll know how to find me." The Apache nodded. "Then we keep moving until he does." They camped that night under the open sky. The stars were brighter than they had been in months, scattered across the heavens like a promise. The girl lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the grass. She thought of everything that had happened, the loss, the fight, the moments of silence between survival and surrender. For the first time, she felt the desert not as an enemy, but as a witness. It had seen her pain, her strength, and now her beginning. By morning, the wind had shifted. A cooler breeze carried with it the scent of distant rain. The Apache glanced toward the horizon, his expression calm. "The storm's changing," he said. "The land's breathing again." As they walked on, the first drops began to fall, soft and slow, settling the dust around their feet. The rain felt like a blessing, washing away the ash and blood of everything they'd left behind. She tilted her face toward the sky, letting it soak her skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever. She smiled. In the distance, the broken mission faded into memory. The desert, wide and endless, stretched before them like a blank page waiting to be written on again. They didn't know what lay ahead, but they walked forward anyway, to survivors carrying the weight of the past and the quiet hope of something new. And as the sun broke through the clouds, touching the wet sand with light, the world seemed to whisper a simple truth, the same one the Apache had lived by, and the same one the girl now carried in her heart, that even in the harshest places, life still finds its way forward. That every ending is just another beginning waiting to be found beneath the dust, top of form.